So why don't we go to Brian?
Ooh, yes. So we have been making really good progress at bringing free public Wi-Fi. I have a quick little presentation. If you don't mind me sharing, I can share that, or I can just talk through it. Oops.
I've just made the switch.
Okay, great.
You should be able to.
Let me pull it up real quick. It's always fun to find the tab. All right. So hopefully you're all seeing this. So in March, we got actually a TIF grant from our 5th District Supervisor Hopkins' office to deploy a free public Wi-Fi to downtown Guerneville. So we were able, the grant was for $30,000. We had actually a private donation of another $5,000. So we were actually able to deploy this project using these funds. So the focus of this project was to primarily do disaster preparedness, as well as equitable access to the internet, and focusing on education. Even though this is an outdoor public Wi-Fi, it still is important for education, digital divide, and allowing access to our low-income community. And then the third one is obviously economic development. So most of the rural areas, especially here in Guerneville, we have like no or very little cell coverage. So a lot of the tourists who comes to our area are sort of slapped in the face by the fact that they can't talk to their family members or their friends, can't even look up where to go. So there's a lack of serious communication. For us, the disaster preparedness is also, dealing with the PSPS events, where we have our power shut off, Comcast may go down, Verizon may go down, and we may not be evacuated. So in this project, some of the nodes for Guerneville in particular, 2 of them are going to be solar powered with a battery backup with a Starlink uplink. So our service area for Guerneville is about 1.5 square miles. We're using 10 Meraki access points by Cisco with 5 internet gateway and backhauls. So the total cost of the hardware and deployment was about $35,000. This includes installation. Our yearly cost is actually we got it down to about $9,000. And again, we're just sort of lining Comcast's pockets on this because we're using business accounts. So we're funded for 4 years, and it comes out to about $15 for 5 years, or about $3 a year per resident. So we've got about 5,014 residents. So this doesn't even include the 2 neighboring towns of Monterio and Rio Neto who would benefit from this. The access points we're using are Cisco Meraki MR86s. They're very small. They discreetly mounted throughout town. And it's going to be giving us a pretty good coverage. So we're currently looking, each access point we can really only afford is a 600 by 35. So it should provide decent coverage. Obviously, if we start having, one of our local events shows, where we might have a few thousand people in town, it might start to suffer the weight. But the good thing about this system is that the Cisco Meraki product is extremely robust. It's cloud controlled. You have a single dashboard. It's self-healing, self-configuring. So as different, say, for example, one of our access points or gateways goes down, it automatically reroutes traffic to the remaining gateways. So that's where Starlink comes into play, is so that as power might go out, or as we might suffer failures in the system, the Starlink nodes will continue to operate. So each of the Meraki product access points uses about 30 watts of power. So it's about that of a light bulb. So we can also have small generators, handheld generators even, or other batteries operating those access points where that are not Starlink, just so that it maintains the coverage. So this is kind of our plan. This is the model that we've done, and we've actually adopted this from Vermont. So when I got the initial funding to do this, I was, kind of figuring out, well, how do we do a free public Wi-Fi that will cover a town for $30,000? And I did some research and I found out the state of Vermont has been doing this for over a decade now. So I reached out to Rob Fish, who's the Deputy Director of Public Services for the state of Vermont. He took my call right away and we hit it off, and he actually gave me a lot of information and a lot of public information, including their cost per route mile. So doing aerial, Vermont was paying $35,000 per route mile before the supply chain issues. And then after the supply chain issues, they're now up to $55,000 per route mile. And this is in part because Vermont is hampered because they have to source in the US. They're not allowed to use Chinese fiber, for example. So part of the reason why their cost per route mile jumped up to 55K is because of their supply chain issues. So Rob turned me on to another set of people who have actually been deploying the free public Wi-Fis throughout Vermont. And Vermont's very similar. So Vermont's 7,000 square miles, we're 9,000 square miles with a population of 600,000. Sonoma County is 1,700 square miles with about 500,000 people. So Vermont is definitely a great comparison of like how they've had success doing their rural broadband deployment and also their free public Wi-Fi. So I reached out to this other group, and they're very excited to start working with us in engineering and building out the free public Wi-Fi for our rural communities. So this model and the technology we're using, they've been doing it for a decade, right? So we're just catching up, which is ironic considering we're California and often viewed as the leaders of technology, especially being so close to Silicon Valley, but yet we're not, right? And so they're, the Cisco Meraki product is a pretty stellar product. It's very robust. It very rarely fails. And the cost of maintenance in managing the technology is pretty low. So this is going live in June, end of June, beginning of July. We've already started the deployment. So I decided to go ahead and file for an ARPA grant to actually to demonstrate scalability. So Guerneville is demonstrating it as a pilot. So I applied for 360,000, actually 390 total costs, and that was to expand Guerneville, as well as also to show that we could duplicate this model in Cazadero, Bodega Bay, Bodega, Forestville, and Jenner. So these are all small rural communities in District 5 here in Sonoma County. This project is actually funded for 5 years, not just the hardware deployment, but operation and maintenance. And total residents served is 10,049, which comes out a cost per resident of $7 per year. So this is free access to the internet, right? And it's also disaster resilient. Each one of these areas will have at least 1 to 2 Starlink nodes, depending upon the size of the network. And part of what we've done is, so in Vermont, they suffer floods, right? And they're getting wetter and wetter while we're getting drier and drier, and we're suffering more fires than we do floods here. And so their architecture and the way they deploy is that typically one of the access points is around a public gathering area. So in times of disaster, you have the ability to support the town population or people coming in order to get information out to the outside world. So again, we're not inventing anything new. We're actually just duplicating what has been successfully done in Vermont. And so this has all been around focusing on education too, like how do we deal with equitable? So in ARPA, our position was, okay, the disaster is important, but equitable access for education and even your workforce is important, right? And so our ARPA grant was focusing on the fact that we can start to bring the free public Wi-Fi to these areas. And once we're there, then the question is then how do we start to expand this, using, dealing with this last mile initiative? Obviously, this program requires fiber to be present in the in the rural area, but this whole program goes hand in hand in lockstep with the last mile and middle mile initiative, because what it does is it gives us an opportunity to start using both to get the middle mile out to the rural areas, and then start to deploy these really cheap, or very inexpensive free public Wi-Fi to make sure everyone has equitable access. So Cazadero is going to have 4 Meraki access points with two gateways. So one will be Comcast, one will be Starlink. Bodega Bay will have 5 with 3 internet gateways and backhauls. The cool thing about Bodega Bay is that the harbor area, there's a lot of low-income people who live in Bodega Bay because it's actually a commercially active area. And so we're going to be servicing these low-income housing and these seasonal workers. And what's really cool is that we expect the signal, because the way the ocean works, there's nothing impeding it, that some of the boats out into the harbor will actually be able to receive free Wi-Fi, which is important because a lot of their low-income workers might be living on the boats out into the harbor. So Bodega is one of our smaller sites. It's just going to be 2 access points. In each one of these, I've been talking to the chamber for everyone, and they're incredibly excited especially about the disaster aspect, as well as the equitable access. Forestville, this one's a little bit up in the air. We originally had El Molino as a location, but that location may change. And then finally, Jenner. So Jenner, with the even though these are going to be 2 separate hotspots, they can still be linked through a line of sight. So the Meraki is actually pretty awesome. You can actually use one of the antennas to get about 1,000 feet to do line of sight to create a linked network, even though they're 2 hotspots. So that's it. So this is exciting. So we got approved. Yeah. And the one thing that's holding us up right now is supply chain issues. So Guerneville, luckily our vendor had 10 of the units in stock. So we were very lucky on that for Guerneville. For the ARPA, unfortunately, we have to wait until there's a 220-day lead time on a lot of this stuff, which is going to be very interesting as we start to do the middle mile and last mile. I'm in direct communication with Rob Fish, at Vermont, and have firsthand experience or knowledge of their challenges with supply chain issues, even though they may be shovel ready, right? So it's going to be very interesting to see how our consortium and how our efforts here are going to manage the supply chain issues, because they're not going away, right? So, again, Vermont is kind of like hobbled a little bit because they have very specific requirements on who their vendors can be, right? They can't use any foreign supply, especially not Chinese. So thank you, and I'm happy. Thank you for inviting me to talk about this and to give this presentation. So
outstanding, Brian. Thank you. I hope our county wakes up to this this kind of possibility.